Project Director for the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. And I want to welcome you to today's webinar, Providing Effective Ongoing Support for Success Mentors. Before we get started, I want to share some brief details about today's webinar, which will last for approximately 75 minutes, with time built in for some interactive discussions and questions along the way. Everyone has been placed on mute upon entry into the webinar. Only our panelists will be unmuted throughout the course of the presentation. Therefore, if you have a question or a comment, we invite you to utilize the chat or the Q&A panels, which are found at the bottom right-hand corner of your screen. And like I said, this will be an interactive session, so our panelists will be looking through those questions and comments as they proceed throughout their presentation. Please feel free to go ahead and submit questions or comments at any point throughout the course of the presentation. It doesn't necessarily need to be, during the interactive pieces or when they ask you to comment. We'll just make sure to be monitoring those throughout the presentation and give that feedback to our presenters as we move along. Today's webinar will be recorded. The recording of this webinar and the slides will be made available to all registrants and will be posted to the National TA Center's temporary website, and we'll be posting up the URL link to that website
Veronica,
for the presentation. Yep.
Veronica, would you mind backtracking a little bit? Your sound went completely off, so we didn't hear you.
Oh, I'm sorry. What was the last thing you heard, Dantel?
That we are recording and that a recording will be sent out or be on the website.
All right, great. Yes. So what we'll do is we'll post the URL link to the website within the chat box so that you can access that at your own convenience. So today's webinar is one of a number being offered by the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center. Dantel, do you want to move to the mission slide? The National Technical Assistance Center was launched in 2016 and is funded by the Department of Education's Office of Safe and Healthy Students. The mission of the center is to disseminate evidence-based practices and build and facilitate communities of practice to help students attend every day, be engaged in school, and succeed academically so that they graduate high school prepared for college, career, and civic life. The two communities of practice referred to in the center's mission are focused on the 30 national My Brother's Keeper Success Mentor sites and the many SIG and SIG-eligible schools throughout the country that are working to implement early warning system programs to address chronic absenteeism. At the bottom of this page, you will see that URL for the center's interim web page with all of our recorded webinars as well as many other resources and presentations that you can access. You won't be able to click on this URL on the slide, unfortunately, but as I said, we'll post that link in the chat function so that you can click on it. So please feel free to visit that site and have a look through all of the resources and materials that are available there. So today's webinar is being presented by Delia Hagan, the Director of Program and Training Delivery at Mentor, the National Mentoring Partnership. Delia is a licensed certified social worker, and in her role at Mentor, she supports the development of the National Mentoring Resource Center, a comprehensive online resource hub for the mentoring field. Delia also manages national programmatic initiatives, including mentor trainings and supports for corporate partners and training and technical assistance efforts for Mentor's National My Brother's Keeper Success Mentor Partnership. So Delia, at this point, I will go ahead and pass the presentation over to you to introduce your co-presenter and get us started with today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Veronica, and thanks, Dantel. All right, so I'm going to move us along and introduce, it's my pleasure to introduce Jean Cohen, who is my partner in crime on a lot of different work that we do here at Mentor National to support school-based mentoring and specifically Success Mentors programs. So welcome, Jean. I'm just going to say a few words about you. Jean is the Executive Director of Mentor New York, and she has been involved with nonprofit organizations for 30 years. She's been with Mentor New York for 21 years, and motivating and directing volunteers is really one of her focus areas. So this webinar is right on target with the work that she does every day. She's trained over 14,000 volunteers in mentoring, and her work has ranged from developing school-based mentoring programs to finding compatible business and government partners to producing online resources and materials and newsletters for programs across New York State. And she travels throughout the state of New York providing training and technical assistance to mentoring programs and coalitions. She's the co-author of Mentoring at the Middle School. And Mentor New York, if you don't know as much about them, some of you on the line may be New Yorkers. Mentor New York assists nearly 600 different mentoring programs and serves over 60,000 young people. And so as the last thing I'd like to share about Jean is that she has mentored the same young woman for 10 years. So she has a lot of different experience related to this topic of supporting mentors today. So welcome, Jean. Thanks for being on the call with us today.
Thank you. It's really a privilege to be here. Working with Success Mentors has been one of our great joys here in Mentor New York, because we've seen how terrific Success Mentors can influence kids' lives going to school. So it's great.
Great, thanks, Jean.
So today we're going to talk about, we have as our objectives a couple of things we want to talk about. Why supporting mentors is so essential to the success of a mentoring program. We don't just pair mentors and mentees, send them off and wrap up 6 months later. Why we want to do that. We're also going to talk about what are some of the different ways to facilitate the conversations and get to what support looks like for the mentors and their mentoring pairs, especially as they face challenges that they may not surface independently, that you may have to draw it out of them a little bit to get to what the issue is. And also, finally, to be able to create a timeline from the beginning match to the closure at the end of the season, even if they're going to meet together again when the school year begins. What are some of the concrete steps that you can take to support mentors throughout that journey, and even especially as they get ready for the closure, that's either the ending of the relationship or the break for the summertime. But what I'd like to ask you right now is to turn to your chat box or your Q&A and tell us, besides these objectives that we have here, are there other things that you'd like us to try to cover? And we'll do our best to make sure we add in the topics that you want to know about in terms of supporting mentors. So you might take a minute and just write that out, and then Delia will read out what we're going to cover next. But take a moment to tell us what is it you want to make sure that you leave today knowing.
Okay, thanks, Jean. And as you all are doing that, it would be great if you could also introduce yourselves, maybe to say who you are, what state you're coming from, and then it would be great for you to share with us if you already have a mentoring program or if you're planning to launch one. So share those details as well as you tell us what you're hoping to get out of today's webinar. You'll notice that Jean and I like to model the skills that we train on, even on webinars when it's a little more challenging to do that. So throughout today's webinar, as Veronica mentioned, we're going to be asking you to chime in and share your experiences and your tips with one another at various points in the discussion, just as you would if you were bringing together a group of mentors to train or support them. So keep in mind as well as we move forward, if you have a burning question about mentor support, so how to deal with a specific situation, you're definitely in the right place, because at the end of this webinar, we're going to be asking you to share some mentor support challenges that you're currently facing or you've faced in the past or that you think you might face if you haven't started a program yet. And then we're going to kind of workshop them in the same way that you might if you were having a mentor support group. So just wanted to mention that, and you guys can feel free to chime in at any point with those ideas. So we're seeing some responses coming in now. So Jean, on the line with us, we've got Midge Miller from Summers, New York, and she says that they have a mentoring program 5 years old. So the program is 5 years old, and there's about 55 kids, which is a pretty large program. Great to have you on again, Midge. All right, who else do we have here? We've got Emily from Portland, Oregon, who works at Children's Cancer Association, and it has a mentoring program for children going through treatment for a serious illness. Wow, that sounds like really important work that you're doing. So glad to have you on as well. Next, we've got someone had shared, something I'd like to learn is how to keep mentors accountable and engaged throughout their match. We're definitely going to be talking about that. I'm so glad you mentioned. And then someone else is saying, can you give us ideas about how to keep mentors engaged when the youth they mentor are not always responsive? Absolutely. That's probably one of the biggest complaints that we've gotten from mentors over the years, is not feeling that the relationship is necessarily that they're connecting, or that they can understand where their mentee is coming from if their mentee is really engaged. So it's a great question. We'll definitely get to that. We also have Adrian from Los Angeles, who says, she's a mentor coordinator for a mentoring program for youth who have experienced sex trafficking. It's a really, really important and underrepresented issue in our country. So important to see that there are mentoring programs responding to that experience. And she says that the program is fairly new, has been up and running for 7 months. Wow, what important work you're doing. Thank you for joining us as well. We have someone sharing, Midge sharing, we have many discussions about confidentiality. If mentors get together to discuss issues, how much can they say without abusing confidentiality? It's a really good question. We can definitely make sure to get to that a bit as we talk about some of those groups. That's definitely something we'll be talking about today. We've got someone from Tacoma, Washington, who says that they're brand new in their position and will be supporting about 35 students per year, starting in their junior year in high school, going through college, which is excellent because we know that transition is so difficult for many students. So wow, great program. And then finally, we've got one other person sharing, Samana from California, working with Power for Youth, a mentoring program for at-risk youth in Long Beach, California, hoping to learn new knowledge on mentor support, especially working with disengaged youth, and the timeline for match support. Our program has been around for 19 years. Wow, what a huge range we have today with us, Jean. This is awesome.
This is awesome. And you're raising, we're hopefully going to hit all these questions in our prepared remarks, but if it's not complete when we cover it, drop in another question, add another comment in the chat box, and we'll expand upon it, because you are raising the questions that really do make a difference in terms of how you support mentors. And the questions about kids who seem disengaged is a really important one for you to be able to reframe for the mentors. What does it mean to have a student who's engaged? What does that look like? It may not look like what the mentor thinks it's going to look like. So these are all great questions. Thank you for sharing them. Okay, so let's move on.
Yeah. One note I wanted to make as we're moving into the next slide is just that this webinar has been designed with a particular program model in mind, which is called the Success Mentors Program. And that's a model that really engages mentors in the school environment with the goal of building a sense of belonging and helping students and families overcome barriers to attendance. So, you know, as Jane and I put together these slides, we had that in our mind as a program that this is kind of responding to, but want to share that everybody who's on the call who shared this content should be very relevant to you because it's really about match support in general. So we're talking a little bit about school context, but we feel like it can be applicable to lots of different program models. And if you do want to learn more about the Success Mentors program, you can certainly find out more on the NSAESC website, which Veronica's going to share that link for you all. So today we're going to focus, as we said, just on one of the 6 elements of effective practice for mentoring, and I won't spend much time here. What I really want to say about this is to download the elements of effective practice if you haven't already, because it really contains such comprehensive information, standards, and benchmarks based on the research and practice insights about really the best practices for every element of a successful, safe, effective mentoring program. And this is what all of the support that Mentor and Mentor New York is based on these research-informed standards. So we're really going to be zeroing in on monitoring and supporting the match, specifically the mentor's experience and what that looks like. Just want to encourage you to really take a look at the elements to learn about all of these different elements, because we can't say enough how important it is to make sure you're hitting each one of these pieces as you're designing a mentoring program and implementing a mentoring program. And then the last thing I'll say before I turn it over to Jean to kick us off with a little bit more interactive activities is just to say that we did do a webinar last year through the National Student Attendance Engagement and Success Center that went into a little bit more detail about the frequency of how you can communicate with parents, students, and mentors, what are the different structures and formats based on the elements of effective practice for doing match support. And this webinar is really going to go a little bit more into the skills that someone who's really supporting mentors is going to be using with mentors on a regular basis to help them, identify, reframe challenges, see their impact, study their impact, strengthen the relationships that they have with students. So we're going to be digging deep into skills that you can use with mentors in that role. But we really do encourage you to check out this other webinar to talk a little bit more about some of the logistics of what this can look like. We will be talking about a timeline for those who are interested. So just wanted to note that as well. And again, to say we're not going to be focusing quite as much on parents and youth and how to check in with and support them, although that's a huge, huge part of a successful mentoring program as well. So just encourage you to check that out. So Jean, I'll kick it over to you to go over our agenda for the rest of our time together.
Okay, so it's always good, especially when you're working with adults, to make sure they know what you're going to talk about. So I'm going to use that example here. We're going to do a small icebreaker to get to know each other. I know there are a lot of you on the call. If you don't feel like answering a answer or putting something in, that's okay. But for those of you that do, it's very helpful. We're going to address why do we want to support mentors? Why can't we just pair them up, send them off, and once a month send an email saying, are you still meeting? Why do we have to support them? And what does that look like? What are some of the key skills you'll want to have when you support mentors? And they list them here. And they make sense as I say them, but we're actually going to take a little time and model some of that. So you can think about how can I implement that, reframing a situation, sharing a different perspective, modeling a way to answer a question or an issue, and celebrating success. We'll be using some examples, real examples from mentoring programs, or some of our personal examples Judy and I call upon to be able to make our points. We're going to do a mentoring challenge workshop, and we'll ask you to give us a real-life challenge, not with names of children or youth, but an example of something you struggled with, and we'll see if we can't join in and give you some other ideas to think about. As Celia mentioned, we'll talk about what a timeline might look like to plan your year, and we'll wrap up with some additional resources that are available both at the website, the NSAESC website, and of course Mentor's website and Mentor New York's website. Okay, so let's move on. So here's an example of an icebreaker which combines providing some support. So one of the things we encourage you to do is have fairly regular times when you have the mentors together, but not with the young people. So the mentors are with their peers, and we ask them to think of a student in their lives. It might be their mentee, but it might be somebody else, their niece, their nephew, a kid who works for them in their business, a student with whom you've struggled to get along or haven't hit it off with right away. So I'd like you to think about somebody like that. It doesn't have to be a mentee in your program. It could be a student in your class if you're a teacher, or your cousin's son, or your neighbor's kid. Is there a student like that? And now that you're thinking about him and you're thinking about annoyed that he threw his baseball through your window again, or whatever thing makes you not get along with him, try to think about one positive quality that the student has. what one thing can you say about the student? Because nobody's all bad. And then think a little bit about something else about the student's interests, family, or background. And somebody's typing in that they're not getting sound. So if you can't hear my voice, you don't know I'm asking this question. If the sound is going in and out for you, do let us know, okay? We'll try to repeat ourselves a little bit. So that's your icebreaker to think about. A student that you may have struggled to get along with, a positive quality the student has, and one other thing that you know about the student. So just go ahead and type something in the chat box or the Q&A, and we'll read out a few of them. We can't read everybody. Okay, so Dantel says that you can hear us. Great. That would be frustrating if you couldn't hear us, I know. Okay, so what's a positive quality that the student has? If those of you who've read any of Charlie Applestein's work, No Such Thing as a Bad Kid, he talks about how all kids have something good, and it's just a question of how we adults characterize it. So a kid who won't stop talking is a kid who has a lot to say and a lot to share. That's not necessarily bad. A kid who's sort of a nag and to get his own way is a kid who could be persistent for the right thing. So how about for some of you, do you have a student that you might have had a hard time getting along with to begin with, and you can think of a positive quality that he has?
Yeah, so Gina will read out some responses that we're getting through the chat box. So I see one person saying, and we won't use names just in case,
Yeah.
but we'll say someone responded saying that their nephew is someone that they have struggled to get along with because he's a little bit of a whiner, which I can understand. Whining is also a big trigger for me. But one quality that they have is that they have, they're a great communicator. So they're someone who is always talking and friendly and connecting with other people, so that is definitely a strength. So that's one. Then we've got someone else chiming in and saying that there's someone in their life who loves to volunteer and do things for others. Another great quality.
Yeah.
A third person chiming in and saying that there's a student in their life who is really withdrawn and difficult to connect with in that way, but they've noticed that they seem to be very interested in sports and a very active kid when they're outside of the classroom. So just a couple examples that we're seeing coming through.
So one of the reasons we're modeling the this as an example is often when you bring mentors together, they're not going to focus on the things that might be perceived as negative. They might feel it's disloyal to their mentee. They might think, oh, you'll think I'm a bad mentor. Maybe I should be able to handle it differently. So we don't necessarily surface the issues that are bothering them. And then again, for some people, that's all we hear, is we don't hear anything positive. We only hear negative. So one of the reasons this is a good way to start out, it's a recognition that it's okay to have things about the students that you find a challenge, and you want to help them, you want to model for them that everybody's got some good quality. So I just did this exercise with my husband. I said, you know, you and your sister complain about your mom. Don't you have any positive memories from when you were a kid? And I made them sit there for 10 minutes while they came up with a bunch of things that they actually enjoyed with their mom. And it's just where they are right now, they're arguing about stuff with her. But remembering that there were some positive things in the good old days that maybe we can move back to that did make the next time we had to have an interaction with her go a lot better. So this icebreaker combines the idea of getting the conversation started, making it okay to share things that aren't perfect, and to look at the mentee as fully nuanced. And if you get really into it well, you can start to ask them, how do you think the student's viewing you? Do you think they have a one-sided perspective about you? So these are all good examples. Thank you. So maybe we can move to the next slide. When we were planning this webinar, we decided to talk about what are the things that we think about match support work. And mine is the Arthur Ashe quote, which says, you start where you are, use what you have, do what you can. So we don't assume that every student we meet, we're going to get him or her to be able to go to Harvard Medical School. Maybe they don't want to go to Harvard Medical School. Maybe they don't want to be a doctor. Maybe we'll be hoping that they can finish high school. Whatever. You start where the student is, and you figure out, what do I have that could help this student, and what can I do? And Delia said, Maya Angelou's is the best, the one that she likes the best. Do the best you can until you know better. And then when you know better, do better. And that's really all we can do, is we take what we know, what we've thought, we try to make our assessment or analysis of the student and our own skills realistic and fair, and then start wherever we are, doing the best that we can right now. And 2 years from now, you might say, oh, I wish I had tried this with Sally. But if at the time you didn't think about it or you didn't have that option, you just go forward. Would it help Sally now? Always starting where we are and doing what we can. So that's a pretty good example of the whole concept of match support. It's not to make every mentor perfect. It's not to solve every possible problem that a mentee has. It's to help the mentor do the best that they can with what their capabilities are and what the student or the student's family is willing to accept. So the one question or one way of looking at this that I sometimes hear from mentors is they have a preconceived notion about how the mentoring relationship is supposed to work and what their impact is supposed to be. And they want to know the right thing to do. And there really often isn't one answer that's going to work for all students. So the question is, what do I think will work for this student? And is this something that I'm comfortable doing? Am I able to have this conversation? Can I talk about these issues? Or do I need to get somebody else to help me with it? And is this the kind of conversation that will help this student, or does she need a different kind of way of looking at it? It's all about what's going to work for that student. So mentors would really like it if we gave them the magic answer that worked for every student. But unfortunately, there isn't one. And your job in supporting the mentors is really to recognize that and to help them recognize it. For one thing, that should take away some of their frustration that they haven't hit upon the magic answer, like everybody else knows the magic answer and I don't. But it also gives them a chance to explore with you, what are some of the other ways I could try to get at solving this problem with the students? Okay, so can we go to the next slide?
Definitely, yeah. And one of the things that you always say, Jean, that I like to quote you on is that match support is really the difference between a good program and an okay program. And that match support is really where the rubber meets the road. So I just wanted to share a couple of things about the research and what the research says, because our mentoring field does have some pretty important research that's been done about why supporting mentors is so important. There's a researcher named Renee Spencer who put out a report called It's Not What I Expected, and it's a qualitative study of youth mentoring relationship failures. And what it goes into is the reasons why mentoring relationships ended early. And one of the #1 reasons why mentors said that their match closed early was because they didn't feel they had enough support. And so, you know, the other thing that we know, unfortunately, is that sometimes mentoring relationships can do more harm than good if they close early or if they close for, you know, negative reasons or for an unresolved reason. We know that young people have often been let down by other adults in their life before they get a mentor. So it's so, so important to support mentors and making sure that they do leave a positive impact and not a negative one. So those are some of the things that stick in our minds when we think about the importance of match support. One thing I'd like to ask you all, and I see some questions coming in, which is wonderful. We'll definitely get to in a few minutes as well. But one thing I'd like to ask you all is if you can think of some possible reasons why mentoring relationships might end. So if you can think of any reasons why a mentor and a mentee might decide we're not going to do this anymore, or they might just sort of fade out, which is unfortunately sometimes what we see. And I'll share with you some of the things that I've seen in my experience as someone who's worked with mentors over time. I feel like there's lots of misunderstandings that happen between adults and young people. I think that often something will happen and it's not discussed, and sometimes folks draw conclusions or assumptions about the other person, and then it just doesn't get resolved. So I think for me, I've seen a lot of lack of communication being the reason why a mentoring relationship might end. And one example is I've had mentors who, show up to meet up with their student that they're matched with, and the student has been late a few times, or maybe they don't show up. Maybe something happened and they forgot. And the mentor starts to think this young person just isn't really interested in meeting up with me. And often when I interview the young person, that's not at all what happened. There's a lot more complexity to their experience than the mentor might think, and there's a lot more to the story. And sometimes it happens on the mentee's end. I'll see, I've had students who will text their mentors, which may or may not be something that your program allows, but we'll have mentees that say, oh, I texted my mentor and he never wrote me back, or he took so long to get back to me. And then mentors will say, well, I was at work and, it's the middle of the day and I didn't have time to call back, or I didn't know that there was something going on. So I think that, it can be miscommunications on both sides, and that's what's so important about your role as someone who can step in and start to clarify, okay, what's really going on here, and try to kind of clarify some of the assumptions that folks might make that can disrupt these relationships. And those are just a couple examples. Someone shared another example. The mentor doesn't hear back from the mentee over and over again, so they stop reaching out. It's definitely one of the top things that I've heard. And as we know, there's so many complexities to students' experiences and families' experiences that can cause that. And so, sometimes we can step in as folks who have relationships with all parties and kind of help overcome some of these barriers once we're aware of them.
And Celia,
those are just a couple of things. Yeah.
Celia, can I just add to this? This is where your role in supporting the match is so critical, because the mentor may be thinking in their own frame of reference and not imagine all the other things that might be keeping a student from reaching out. So I had a program where the mentor just stopped calling the student, and when I reached out to her, she said, well, I left 4 messages on the answering machine and she never called me back. And I said, well, that does sound like she doesn't want to talk to you, but are you sure she got the messages? And she said, why wouldn't she have gotten them? I said, well, she lives with her father and her 3 teenage brothers. So it's quite possible, if I remember my teenage brother, that she never got the message. And that is exactly what happened. Even her dad didn't tell her when her mentor called. So she had never gotten those messages, so she didn't call the mentor back. The mentor assumed she didn't want to be in relationship with her. That's why your role in supporting the match is so important, because excuse me, that match ended even though both parties wanted to keep talking to each other.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and those are the things that we just really want to prevent. Absolutely. Yeah, and a couple things I'll say are just about the importance of match support. It's also a screening tool for you. We do a lot on the front end in our programs to make sure we're finding adults that are the best fit for our mentees, but often we don't know how they're going to do until they actually start working with mentees. So we're not going to talk a lot about a screening in this webinar. There's tons of resources on the Mentor website and in the elements about screening, but one thing we will say is that supporting your mentors and checking in with them is part of your screening process. You want to know that they're engaging in relationships with a healthy sense of boundaries, with healthy expectations. And if you're finding that that's not the case, it's an important thing for you to be able to step in on. For those who are curious about timelines, one thing we often say is that it's really helpful to be more in touch with people in the beginning of the relationship. to have more frequent check-ins and make sure that things are going well, because these are, new relationships. Folks are navigating those sometimes rocky waters of trying to form a new relationship, and the challenges they face are often a little bit more frequent, or, they may have more questions. So it's helpful to kind of front load some of the support that you provide, and then kind of scale back as you see that relationship has kind of gotten off the ground. Not to say that it's not important to check in with folks as, even who have been matched for years. It's very important to do that as well, but it doesn't have to necessarily be quite as frequently. So I will move us quite along. Jean, did you have anything else to share about that before we talk about challenges?
Well, and I think the first line of the challenges slide really gets to why the support in the beginning is so important, because the mentors aren't necessarily going to surface the problems, but you as the coordinator or the supervisor want to elicit from them, how is it going? What were you expecting? Is it matching what you thought would happen, to get to what they may not even be reaching out to you to say that there's a problem because they're not sure it's a problem. So surfacing those things right away allows you to try to intervene and help reset expectations in a reasonable way, and keep the match on track. So I think that your role in keeping this going can't be underestimated in terms of how much influence you can have in keeping those matches going. So why is it, can we just go back? Did I hit everything on that slide? A lot going on under the surface. Okay, so I'm just going to tell you a real life story. I was training at an elementary school out on Long Island. They had fourth graders being mentored by employees at Northrop Grumman. And so it was a feedback session. I had already trained them in the beginnings of being a mentor. So this was about 3 months into their relationship with their students. And I said, so how's it going? Who has a problem they want to talk about? Nobody had a problem. So I thought, oh, I have another 45 minutes to talk. So I made them go around the room and each one tell me something that surprised them about being in a mentoring relationship. So I'm just going to share with you a little bit of the detail to get my point across. So one guy said, well, I was surprised how polite the kids are. I wasn't sure why he needed a mentor. And then a woman said, well, the little boy I'm mentoring, I found out his mother has stage 4 breast cancer. And they should have told me that. He's going through a lot. And I thought, yeah. So we confirmed with her and talked about how that's really a challenge for this little boy. And he's probably going to have some days when he's more upset than others. And so we went over that. And then we did 2 more people. And then the woman said that she got into trouble because her little girl said that it was going to be her birthday the next week, and nobody in her house was going to wish her happy birthday. She wasn't going to get a birthday card, and she was really sad about it. So the mentor brought her those little plastic barrettes that you buy at the drugstore for $5, and to wish her a happy birthday. And the next day, the girl's father went up to school furious because the family are Jehovah's Witnesses. They don't celebrate birthdays. And he felt the school was disrespectful. He wanted to take the little girl out of the mentoring program. And so the mentor felt terrible that she had inadvertently, not intentionally, but inadvertently insulted the family, blah, blah, blah. And then, so then we went around 2 more people, and I got to the last person, and she said, well, I know you told me not to talk about religion. I thought, oh my God. She said, well, my mentee said that her mother died and she misses her. And so the mentor said, well, in my religion, I believe I'll see my father again, but even if you don't believe that, I have a little bit of my father in my heart. And I think about him. And she said, that's not going to happen. My grandmother told me I won't see my mother. My grandmother told me that my mother went to hell because she deserved to die. This is a 4th grader. I tell you all this story because this was the same group of people when I said, do you have any problems you want to talk about? Nobody raised their hands. Everybody said everything was fine. These are not things that are fine. These are real challenges. These people are not therapists, they're not psychologists. These kids have real issues. The mentors should have help to navigate it, to know that they're doing the best that they can, maybe have some different ideas about how to handle it, and have support, because it's upsetting. After the young woman whose mother died, the people in the room were crying, and this was the same group who said, oh no, we don't have any problems. So it's very important for you in your role supervising mentors to be able to get to them, to hear what's really going on under the surface, to hear what things that they think they should be doing better, or is this my fault, or whatever. That's an important part of mentor support. It's not just being there to answer their questions, but to help them get to the questions that they haven't brought up yet. The other thing is, when you do bring them together and they hear each other talking, they can actually be validated in terms of what they're experiencing, like, oh, so sometimes their mentee doesn't want to talk either. Or, wow, that sounds difficult. I guess I'm doing a better job than I thought. As one of my colleagues, Bruce, always says, it helps validate, normalize their experiences, that this is what normally happens, and it is a challenge, and it doesn't mean I'm not doing a good job. That's all really important to keep that mentor from walking away from the relationship. Okay, so can we move on to the next slide?
Definitely, yeah. And for the next few minutes, Jean and I are going to be talking about some key skills that each of us has used in our work supporting mentors. And then we're going to share some stories and examples and ask you to share some stories and examples of how you may have used those skills with mentors so far. But first, I just want to share with you some options and formats for how you can communicate with mentors throughout the year. So the first is what we call a case management approach. This is a term we borrow from the social work world. And really all it means is you are trying to make sure that you have a pulse on all of the different relationships that you have on your quote-unquote caseload, meaning, you know, how many different mentoring relationships you've got in your program. And someone earlier asked about what's the ideal amount of mentoring relationships for one person to be case managing might be. And I can speak to that a little bit later. We do have a resource on the Mentor website that makes some recommendations around that I'll point you to. But it certainly is a challenge. You know, the more mentoring relationships you have that you've matched up, the harder it is to keep a pulse on what's going on with everyone. But the key here is, you know, staying connected and making sure that folks know that you're there for them if they have any struggles. So building those relationships with mentors where you know, they feel heard, they feel seen, and they know that they can come to you if they want to troubleshoot or just have you listen so that they can reflect on what's going on. And so then we've got structured group discussions. Those are things that we've been alluding to. Jean just mentioned a little bit about her support group that she had for mentors. You know, this is really, as she said, a unique opportunity for mentors to validate each other's experiences and teach and learn from each other. One of the big tips I have for the groups that I've facilitated with mentors is I'll often reach out to someone in advance and say, hey, Joe, can you really, can you share, you know, the experience you had with your mentee around, you know, engaging him when you felt like he wasn't that into you, and how you kind of broke the ice, because I really think that Frank is struggling with his new mentee, and he could really, you know, learn from you about how much time it takes to get to know someone. So kind of cherry picking and putting a bug in people's ears so that they will connect with each other in meaningful ways. As Jean said, it's so often so hard to get those conversations started, to have someone be the first person to break the ice. I know this might be a little controversial depending on your setting, but I have found that when you have wine at an event, mentors are much more likely to come. When we call it a wine and cheese, you know, chat, discussion, people are much more likely to be there, and they don't roll their eyes quite as much when I say, well, please come to our group and share your experience. I think it's important for people to feel that their presence there is valuable. So when you share how important it is for them to share their story with someone else, you might get a little bit better attendance and more meaningful interactions for folks. And then you've got informal connections. You know, if you work in a school and you know your mentors are so busy, they're school-based mentors, teachers, school staff, you might decide to have, you know, coffee and donuts one morning to talk about, you know, how to approach the holidays that are coming up and how do you deal with gift giving. You might, as, you know, the year goes forward and we're starting to get towards the end of the year, you might have, you know, a quick lunch check-in or an after-work wine and cheese, you know, night to just talk a little bit about closure coming up, and it doesn't have to feel so structured like a support group. It can feel a little bit more natural, and an opportunity for mentors to get to know and chat with each other. And then finally, a great opportunity to actually see mentors and mentees in action and get more information about what's really going on with mentoring relationships is to have a group activity where mentors, mentees, and sometimes even parents are all together. You know, maybe it's an event, you know, a game night, something like that, but you can really see the interactions live, and you can get more information about what you might need to actually, you know, bring up with people, both about negative things that might be happening and also positive things that might be happening that mentees or mentors may not even see how well they're doing or how important their work is. So those are just a couple of pieces about the ways in which you can do this work throughout the year.
So I'm just going to mention, when Delia mentioned group activities, I'm mindful of a program that was for kids on probation, and they had an apple picking day. So the mentors and mentees went out apple picking, and one of the kids came up to the coordinator and said, if I'm not on probation anymore, does that mean I can't see my mentor? And the coordinator said, no, you can see your mentor as long as you want. And the kid did that fist thing like, yes, you know what I mean, when they pulled it close to his chest, like, I'm so excited. His mentor never heard that, but the coordinator did. And the coordinator immediately went over and said to the mentor, I know you think that he's not very talkative and he's not sharing a lot, but he's really excited that he can keep seeing you after his probation is over. So they may not tell you that they want to be with you, but they're acting like they want to be with you, and you want to remember that. And that was an important thing she did for that mentoring pair. So we're going to, one of the things we talk about as one of the skills of doing this is really helping the mentors share perspective and think differently. So we're going to try to give you a mentor support story as an example how we use these skills. And if you want to chime in and share your own story, if you've used this, by all means join us and tell us about it. So I'm going to use the example of a mentor who makes assumptions about the family and their kids and whether or not this is accurate. So he's thinking, I'm the only one who cares if this boy goes to school or not. And what the math support person did was actually sit down and brainstorm with the mentor. What are some of the things that might be keeping this student from coming to school? And they came up with a list of 12 things, which included the student had to catch 2 buses, and sometimes you had to wait. If the first bus was late, you had to wait half an hour for another bus. That the student had to drop off his younger siblings. That the student had asthma, and if the student was the night before in the emergency room, the mother would send it. You can imagine the list went on and on. They came up with 12 things, and the mentor said, so which of these is true? And the coordinator said, all of those things is true for this boy. And so it's really amazing that he comes to school as much as he does, which is a totally different perspective, reframing, a different perspective on that student's life. So it's almost like the mentor could go back to the student and say, wow, you have a lot of challenges. I'm impressed you're here today. Completely changing the focus and how they're going to look at each other. Here's another example. The mentor helps a student apply for a summer program, and it would require her to live away from home for the summer. And she's afraid to go. So the mentor is saying, but this is such a great opportunity. Why don't you want to go, and so on. Can you guys think of a reason why the student might not want to go to the summer program that would cause her to live away from home? You got any ideas about what that might be? That's a great one is her family needs her support. She feels like she has a responsibility at home. That certainly was true. I'm a lot older than my brother and sister, and there were a lot of times when I didn't get to do things because I was supposed to watch them. So it was almost like I was the third adult in the house. That's a really good example. What if it's culturally not what your family does to have your children live somewhere else, never been away from home, right? We just moved my aunt, who's 93, into an assisted living facility. She's lived in the house that my grandfather built. She was actually born there for her entire life because you don't live anywhere else unless you get married. So that's what, you know, my family's culture did. You live with your parents until you get married and live somewhere else. So is that the reason? Is it that they need her to work? There could be a lot of reasons. It could be she's nervous too. So there are ways to find out what it is and help the mentee decide what's the best thing for her to do. Okay? It's not necessarily that the family doesn't care that she has this good opportunity. So let's go on to Reframe. So Reframe, my husband says I sound like Pollyanna if I reframe too much. But I'm going to tell you about a mentor who was an aide in a school. She was mentoring a 14-year-old girl who was a freshman, and they had lunch together once a week. But every morning, the student would stop in and say hello to her. And just, you know, like a drive-by, wave hello, whatever. Her attendance improved. She was coming to school every day. But the mentor was frustrated because the girl couldn't decide what she wanted to do for her career. And so one week she would say she was going to be a teacher, and the next week she wanted to be a social worker, and then she wanted to be the nurse. And the mentor said, shouldn't she be deciding what she wants to do? So my point to her was, let's talk about what success is for this mentoring relationship. So the success for this mentoring relationship is the student wants to see you, wants to confide in you, is engaged in school, is coming regularly. All those things were happening between this mentor and mentee. I wanted this mentor to know she was getting an A+ as a mentor. And P.S., most 14-year-olds don't know what they want to do. Plenty of 25-year-olds don't know what they want to do. In fact, I know 45-year-olds who still don't know what they want to do with their careers. So the fact that this 14-year-old hadn't decided what she wanted to do doesn't seem to me like that's a problem. And when I reframed it for her saying, look, she wants to see you, she stops in every day, so you know she's in school, she's glad to see you, she's talking about joining a helping profession, that's probably because she's watching you in your work and she's emulating you. I think all the things you set out to do in your mentoring relationship, you're accomplishing. And that means that you're being successful as her mentor. And she said, oh, I thought my job was to help her choose a career. So it's really important to reframe what's going on between the mentor and mentee. And it's also important to define for a mentor what's success going to look like. And again, not everybody's going to go to Harvard Medical School. I didn't go to Harvard Medical School. I think I'm a success. But maybe I'm not in some people's eye. But what success look like, and how do we reframe it? That can be your job, and it can make the difference between frustration on the mentor's part and a really strong and solid relationship that the mentor and mentee can continue. By the way, they did continue until the girl graduated from high school, and she went off to community college to study physical therapy. So having a reframe on what's realistic and helpful. Those people who said the mentor doesn't call me back, mentee doesn't call me back, then you want to think about, one, are there impediments to getting the message, like the girl I told you about? Does the family only have prepaid phones? Does the phone number change? What are some of the reasons? But also, does the mentee show up when they're supposed to show up but not call the mentor back? So take a look at that. Can you reframe that for a mentor and say, okay, maybe there's something about calling your office number that's frightening to him, and he's uncomfortable doing that. Can he send you a text message, or is there another way to communicate with him? But if he shows up, even if he's not returning your phone calls, can we frame that in a different way and move it forward? And that's your job because the mentor doesn't necessarily step back to take a look at it. I'll give you one more example to think about. We had a student who had been getting a couple of Fs and was working with a middle school mentor, and I think in his math class he got a C, and the mentor said to me, I really wanted to congratulate him for getting a C. And I said, the way you said it, it makes it sound like you didn't congratulate him. She said, no, I didn't. I said, well, why wouldn't you have congratulated him? She said, I thought, should I congratulate him for a C? That's not really very good. And I said, well, you said he had been getting an F. A C is a lot better than an F. I said, whose voice is that? She said, oh, it's my dad's voice. He would never have praised anybody for getting a C. Okay, so we're going to leave behind our own baggage. But this student who was getting an F, getting a C is a lot better. And maybe a C is the best he can do. Or maybe he's working from F all the way up to A, but he's sort of passing through C right now. Again, reframing it and looking at it about this student. Where is the student? Where's he come from? Where's he going? What's success going to look like? Can I help this mentor see that this is improvement? There's connection. He was excited to tell her that he got a C. Those are all things to be celebrated and build on. That's what really good support gets you to. So Delia is going to share a story with you about a mentor who didn't feel his mentee really needed him.
Yeah, thanks, Jean, so much. Yeah, and this moves us a little bit into the skill of modeling, which I think is a great approach in support groups. That's one sort of example of how you can model the skills that you want mentors to be using with their mentees. So I'll share a story about a mentor support group that I was facilitating a couple of years ago. It was specifically for mentors who are working with students who are in foster care and students who had an incarcerated parent. And so it was pretty clear to us, you know, as the match support folks, that, you know, these are all students who really need someone to show up for them. There's no question that they need an adult who's going to be there for them, who's going to really show up 100%, because they had been let down by many adults in the past. But, you know, it was always surprising to me, and I think a lot of the mentors themselves, how insecure a lot of mentors are about starting a new relationship with a young person, especially a teenager. That seems to be a little triggering for some adults, even young adults, who are really fearful about whether, you know, young people are going to actually like them or want to connect with them. So a support group really helped me work with a mentor who was coming in and saying, you know, I'm working with this kid, he's great, but he just doesn't seem that into the activities that we're doing. And for those of you who asked earlier about how mentors can work with kids or young people who are, you know, less engaged, at least at first sight, who don't seem that into the relationship, this is something that came up all the time for me and for the mentors that I worked with. And so we really tried to model a couple of things for this mentor as we were sitting with him in our support group setting. First of all, we heard him out. You know, we let him share, hey, here's the things I've tried. I've tried sports. I've tried taking him out to, you know, to the movies. I've tried this. I've tried the arcade, and it just doesn't seem like he likes anything. And we don't ever talk about anything. It just seems like there's so much silence, and, you know, I could be anyone and all of this. We kind of let him vent. And that was a way of sort of modeling for him, too, how important it is to just sort of start with the feelings. When someone is frustrated, when they're feeling vulnerable, they've agreed to share something about themselves that they're not super proud of. You know, we wanted to model for this mentor and for all the mentors in the group, just letting the person vent, just letting them say, you know, here's all the things I've tried, I'm frustrated, I don't feel like my work is meaningful. And then from there, you know, once he was able to vent his frustrations, that's when we started to kind of ask questions. And try to get more information about the situation versus jumping in and giving advice, which all of us as adults seem to love to do. This support group gave us a chance to try to model that skill of asking questions, learning more about the situation instead of just giving advice and being prescriptive about the way we were going to tell this mentor how to do a better job. So we asked him, you know, well, what do you think your mentee is into? What has he mentioned to you that he likes? you know, what's going on with other relationships in his life? Do you think this is unique to you, or do you think this is something that's gone on with other people, like his teachers or his parents? What have you heard? And so, you know, as we asked those questions, it seemed like the mentor really was able to kind of paint a picture. We were eventually able to get to the fact that this was a young person who had been let down, again, as we said, by so many other adults in his life, and who probably was protecting himself to some point, to some extent, from getting too invested in the relationship and keeping the mentor at an arm's length until he felt like he was really going to stick around. And the way we got there was because a lot of other mentors said, you know, this is my experience too. You know, I have a mentor, a mentee with a similar background, and I found that it took a really long time for him to feel comfortable with me and open up. And so feeling validated and hearing the story of someone else was really disarmed this mentor and made him feel like, you know what, I'm not alone here. This is something that doesn't really have anything to do with me at all. And it's really, really similar skills that we want our mentors to be using with their mentees. A lot of folks, even, you know, teachers and other folks who work with kids every day, don't necessarily practice those skills of active listening, of letting someone, you know, lead with feelings first, letting them vent, and then asking questions before giving advice. So that's just one example about modeling. And you can certainly do that one-on-one as well, and not just in a group, but wanted to share that story. And then there's one more skill we wanted to talk about, which is celebrate. And Jean, I think you have some examples of celebrating. I wanted to share a quick one about what I mean by this. And when we say celebrating, we mean celebrating progress, celebrating success with mentors. And I don't always mean, you know, happy-go-lucky, giving them an award or a medal or, you know, even a thank you, although all of that means so much to mentors who are really working hard to connect with young people. But sometimes it really means just acknowledging their progress and everything that's going well. And Jean has so many examples of this. One that I'll share is that I got a phone call from a mentor who was so overwhelmed. She had been trying to connect with her mentee for a long time. She had one of those mentees that we talked about earlier who doesn't really like to open up or share feelings. It seems like everything's going fine in their life, and you're kind of wondering, well, do they like me? Do they have anything they want to talk about? Am I not asking the right questions? You know, do we have a meaningful connection? So that had been going on for months. And then finally, the mentee sat down with the mentor and just opened up to her like a fire hose, like a faucet of problems that had been going on in her life for so long. There were issues with her parents. She was arguing with her mom. She was wanting to run away from home. She had just had sex with her boyfriend for the first time and didn't know how she felt about it and wanted to process that with her mentor. And the mentor, as you might imagine, was like deer in the headlights. She had no idea where to start. There was so much going on at the same time, and she had just started, you know, feeling like this wasn't going to go anywhere. Her mentee was never going to share anything with her, and then all of a sudden, you know, all of this information comes. So she called me frantically, where do I start? You know, what am I supposed to say to these things? And I had to pause and you know, and tell her, hey, let's take a minute to think about, you know, the very important thing that just happened, which is that you know, were able to convey to your mentee enough times that you were there for them, that they could feel comfortable with you sharing these things. And it's such a huge deal that she shared these things. I mean, these are issues that she's been carrying around and not sharing with anyone for so long. And really, that's the most important thing that has already happened here, is that she was able to share that with you and get that off her chest and not feel so alone. And then, of course, we troubleshooted the issues and the real questions she had, but just taking that time to celebrate the progress that happens when day after day mentors show up for kids. Is so, so important. So, Jean, I'll just check in with you and see if you have anything to share about that one.
Well, and in fact, let me piggyback on what Delia just described. It's not just that you want to celebrate with that mentor that she made the connection, but the mentor's overwhelmed by all the problems. And if the mentor's overwhelmed, how could a teenage girl who has no one to talk to not be overwhelmed? And her mentor could model for her, wow, these are challenges. We should get some people who know some more about some of these things to help us, or that we can talk to, or we can get information from her. No wonder you're not being able to sleep at night or worried. These are a lot of challenges. It doesn't mean you can't do it, and we're going to try to find solutions, but wow, I'm so glad you talked to me about it, and together we're going to find a solution. So she can actually model for her how to tackle complicated problems. So she can celebrate that the mentee made a good connection with her, and modeled with her ways to try to find solutions, because for many of the problems these young people face, there isn't one magic solution that's going to work for everybody. I gave you the example of the young woman who didn't want to be successful and congratulate a kid who was getting a C. It happens all the time with success mentors who are working on chronic absenteeism. A kid comes to school 2 days a week and starts meeting with a success mentor, and she's coming now 4 days a week. And I'm so excited, and I say to you, are you celebrating that? And the mentor says, but she's still not coming 1 day a week. And my answer is, she's coming 100% more than she was 2 months ago. She's going to learn stuff those days she's in the class. Yes, you can shoot for perfect attendance, but let's not let perfect be the enemy of good. And good is she's coming 100% more 4 days a week. Let's celebrate that. Let's acknowledge that. Let's acknowledge that it's meant for her. And so move ahead and continue to move forward. Let's move on to the next slide. And I want to just ask you, I'm going to ask you, the people in the audience, to tell us, do you have a scenario from a mentor that you want to workshop as a group? Just like we described workshopping some of these. You don't have to give us details of your program or the student or the mentor's name, but is there a story that you want to put up in the chat box or the Q&A that we can use as an example to get feedback from the others? So think about if you've got a problem that you've been scratching your head.
And in the meantime, Jean, since we have about 10 minutes left, I thought maybe I could ask you some of the questions that we've gotten in from the audience as we've been going through. So one person wants to know about confidentiality and how to manage that when you have a mentor group, discussion group, or support group. How do you make sure that the issues that are shared are kept confidential?
So many schools utilize a confidentiality form that a mentor signs so that they agree that they're not going to reveal any information about the student to anybody except the people who supervise the match in the mentoring program or other mentors. And that means what they hear from their student or from any other students. And there are sample confidentiality forms floating around. I'm pretty sure US DOE had one from the Success Mentors, Delia. And it's not a bad thing to have that conversation and to talk about it. But that's the expectation. If I'm in a support group with mentors, I'm not going to talk about, when I leave that group, nothing that's repeated there should be repeated by me to anybody. Not another teacher of the students, not the students' parents, nobody. It's confidential in our group. And that should be true with any mentoring program, whether it's Success Mentors in a school or another independent organization that's running a mentoring program. What the students share with you is confidential, unless, of course, you think that it demonstrates that the student might be at risk, in which case you have procedures in your program about how to handle risky behavior for the student and how the student knows you're going to handle that.
Perfect. Thank you so much. And we can send out that form after this so that folks have it. Okay, I do have one challenge that I wanted to throw at you, Jean, for you to workshop for us. And ideally, when we say workshop, we also are hoping that folks in the audience are going to chime in as well to think through, help us think through this challenge and what to do about it. So here's the challenge. This person is saying that there's a situation where a student says he has to go home after school every day to take care of his sick sibling. And so the mentor is alarmed by this and says that they feel like the student shouldn't be doing that and that that's not a role the student should be playing, and it's keeping them away from doing sports and other enrichment activities that the student could really benefit from. So what would we recommend that the mentor should do in this situation?
So that's a tricky one. What do the people on the call think? Do you have any suggestions, or have you experienced something like that? So we've had a couple of families like this, and there were different solutions that were tried by the mentors in different settings. In one family, they were a newly immigrated family. The mother had a nursing degree, but the father did not go to college. But they very much wanted their son to be able to go to college, but he needed to earn a scholarship. And the mentor actually talked to the student about how extracurricular activities could actually help college applications. And so the student asked the mentor to talk to his family, and instead the mentor talked to him about it, some of the things he could talk about, and then he and the mentee actually brainstormed other ways that there would be somebody else to help take care of his brother. It was his younger brother. And they actually came up with a sort of a communal babysitting in their neighborhood, where a mom who stayed at home watched the brother 3 days a week, and in return, the mentee's mother made dinner for the family the nights that, I don't remember exactly the details, but they swapped off babysitting with making dinner, and the mentor went with the student to talk to the coach that he would only be able to come 3 days a week to practice, not 4, but he promised to practice on the weekends, whatever worked out. And he went off to Hunter on a scholarship, by the way, ultimately. So it was a way that the mentor actually helped the student articulate what he wanted and explain it to his parents. They helped brainstorm what some other solutions could look like. By the way, this communal arrangement that they had in the neighborhood made them friends with people that they didn't know that well. So it all worked out in for the good, but it required multiple layers and multiple conversations, and not just plunging ahead saying, you have to let your son do it, it's the right thing to do. That wasn't the way that it would work. So that's an example of helping the student be empowered, coming up with other solutions, really focusing on what the student wanted, and presenting it in a way so that it wasn't a criticism of the family, but this is a real problem, and it's a good thing to study. Any other things you want to workshop? We have just another minute or two to do this.
No other challenges that I'm seeing in here, but I think you know, if folks have other questions, please feel free to type them in the chat box. And while you do, I'll just quickly mention the timeline that folks had been interested in hearing about earlier. So the programs that we heard about who are on the line may have different timelines or expectations for the length of the relationship that, you know, the mentoring relationships in your program. We've just kind of mocked up this very, very brief timeline for school-based programs that might have just kind of a designated one-year program year. So what we have here is the fall, you know, as early as possible in the season, you want to have your mentor training before you match your mentors and mentees, and that's a critical piece of the support you provide because it really enables you to equip mentors with the skills on the front end to actually build these relationships with their mentees before they're matched. And then you have your match kickoff, whether that's a big group event or individual meetings that you have with your mentees and mentors. And then some may be, you know, meeting in small groups, and that's fine as well. So you kick off those relationships in the fall, and then in the winter is really a good time to bring folks back together for one of the structured discussion groups or the support groups that we provided, and you can sneak in some training on some special topics like cultural competency or dealing with conflicts as you're facilitating those groups. So it can be a great time to bring people back together. And then in the spring, you might decide to have like an informal coffee and donuts time for mentors to come together and talk a little more informally. And this is a really important time to start talking about the end of the year and whether mentors plan to stay in touch with their mentees long term. You want to check in with mentors about that so that you can help them prepare their mentees, you know, months in advance for the possibility of closure or whether they'll stay in touch mentees really don't want to be dealing with that type of uncertainty throughout the year. They want to know, as Jean said earlier, if they're going to be staying in touch with this person and how and what that's going to look like. So starting to prepare mentors so that they can prepare mentees. And then at the end, checking in with them again towards the end of the spring to find out how those conversations went, how things concluded, celebrating the successes not only with mentors but with mentees as well. So this is just one example of how this could look for you. And again, it's going to be so customized to the work that you do depending on what your mentors need from you. And in between, you may do emails and different types of informal communications to check on folks and see how they're doing. So we welcome any other questions that you have in the chat box, and Jean and I can stay on the line for a few more minutes if folks do want to ask some questions. But I did want to offer some resources. Someone asked earlier about the number of relationships that one staff person should be managing on a caseload. And we do have a link here, which I'll send out to everyone, this deck, so you can access it after the webinar. By tomorrow, you should receive it from us. But it's called Tools to Strengthen Match Support and Closure, and it does have a great kind of staffing calculator that you can use to determine what's the best number for one person to manage. We've got a lot of information here about the elements, which we mentioned earlier, and the other webinar about this topic that you can access. And we really, really encourage you, if you are looking for more intensive support on this topic, to apply for no-cost technical assistance from the National Mentoring Resource Center, which Mentor and Mentor New York are a part of. You can get free coaching and training from us to help you with a match support plan or anything else that you're struggling with your program. And so I'll just turn it over briefly to Veronica to close this out, and just want to say thank you so much to Jean for all the insights you shared today.
Oh, and thank you everyone for joining us and giving up your time. We hope this was helpful as you go forward in trying to run your mentoring program.
Agreed. Thank you, Delia. Thank you, Jean. And you'll see that Dantel was kind enough to also post again the URL to the center's temporary website, where you can view a recording of this webinar as well as all of our previous webinars and materials from all of our convenings that we've had over the last couple of years. So please feel free to visit that site at your convenience. And I want to send one final thank you out to our presenters today. We hope you found this information helpful and informative, and we hope to see you again on a future webinar. Thank you so much, everyone. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.